So you guys know that we like to read, and like 15 years ago, someone gave Elisha a book by Douglas Wilson, and then I found this book, Future Men, at my grandma's house, and we had reforming marriage in our house growing up, and so over the years, we've just become very, very familiar with Douglas Wilson and his family and his work, and I cannot think of someone who is better. Elisha and I were just talking about this. Aside from our parents, I can't think of anyone who has been more of a mentor in our life or continues to be a mentor in our life when it comes to family and raising a God-honoring family. There are so few people out there that can truly say that their children, all of their children are walking with the Lord, all of their grandchildren are walking with the Lord, their great children now are being born, and just have that legacy of faithfulness. That's something that we so want in our home. And I think that as you guys listen to this episode, it's going to come across how Doug communicates differently than I think so many other teachers on the family that start to skew legalistic. Maybe they take a negative turn when it comes to teaching on the family. And I think Doug hits on a few reasons why his teaching on family is different and why it feels so freeing, why it feels like we're free to apply it in the way that works best for our family, but is still so biblically based and so unapologetic and unmovable when it comes to the foundation of what God's design is. And so all that said, you guys are going to love this interview on family. I think you're going to be so encouraged, whether you have children that are in the toddler years, or you have children that are in high school, college age, and beyond. So anyways, Elisha, do you want to read a little bit about official reading about?
This is a short one. This was on the back of, one of his books that we've loved, The Federal Husband. This says, Douglas Wilson is a pastor at Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, and has helped found institutions such as New St. Andrews College, Logos School, the Association of Classical Christian Schools, and Grayfriars. Wow. He is the author of Rules for Reformers, Empires of Dirt, and Same-Sex Mirage. He and his wife, Nancy, have 3 children and 18 grandchildren. Those are just a few books. He has officially written over 100 books, which is, not bad.
Kind of crazy. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoy this episode. If you do, like it, share it, comment down below on what stuck out to you, and share it with the people that you know and love, because that is how this podcast gets out to more like-minded families. And we just cannot thank you guys enough for being a part of the Now That We're a Family community and bringing other people into it, because we love meeting you guys and we are so encouraged by you. And we hope that you guys are encouraged by the guests that we're able to get on the show.
The Now That We're a Family podcast.
All right, Pastor Douglas Wilson. It's a treat for Katie and I to be able to sit down and speak with you. I feel like, whether it's via your children's books, your children's podcast, your books, right here, actually, I'm going to pick these up because right here, I was just saying before, we've got Reforming Marriage, Covenant Household, Future Men, Federal Husband, and we care about family deeply. Our audience cares about family deeply. Mm-hmm. And I would say this is like the ultimate Christian family starter pack right here. And we use your resources quite often. We're grateful for them. And I'm curious, because maybe you can tell us one of these first books. I think you wrote back in the mid 90s, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm curious. Okay, what was kind of the original impetus in you deciding to write about family, to speak to family? Because not every pastor necessarily has that inclination, it seems like, but you did a while back. And so what's kind of the origin story in you starting to write and speak about family?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was part of the ministry that my father had here in Moscow. He had an organization called Community Christian Ministries. And one of the things that he would do as a conference speaker and in a college town is he would have a series of talks or messages or Bible studies that he called Life Between the Sexes. So that was sort of an environment that I came of age in, and he would just talk about basic common sense stuff. After I became a pastor, which was in 1977, and the church started to grow, there were a lot of young people. It was a college age church. And as people started to marry, and I was starting to do premarital counseling, marriage counseling, I thought, why don't I just write these things down and have it in book form so that I can have a platform from which to go further. So if New St. Andrews College is here now, and for example, Reforming Marriage was that first marriage book. A bunch of the kids have read that book going through. There's a section in the curriculum where they cover all the family stuff. And then when they get engaged their junior or senior year and they come in for pre-marriage counseling, I can sort of stand on that platform and go further. And that was the idea, is to consolidate and put these ideas in one place that I could develop and build on.
So basically, like, I'm going to cover all the basics and then we can move on instead of continually covering the basics.
Yeah, instead of having to say the same things over and over again. Yeah.
Wow. And I'm curious if you can point to any particular things since then, because we're probably going on maybe close to 30 years now since you've written that you said Reforming Marriage. What are there any particular changes in the general, in family environment across Christendom, or in your church in particular, maybe, where you're thinking, man, I would have kind of been a little bit more specific in this area of the book, knowing what I know now 30 years later? Or are there any changes that you see where it's like, yeah, the principle stays the same, but maybe the application would be articulated different? Is there anything that stands out to you along those lines?
Well, the big one, this isn't so much on family life, but one of the family adjacent books that I wrote is Fidelity, How to Be a One-Woman Man. And it's astonishing. And that book is not that old. It's not as old as the other family books, but there's nothing in it about the whole tranny thing. There's, or very, very little. And so we've, just since the publication of that book, the outside culture has gone off a cliff. And I don't have a chapter on sex dolls. I don't have a chapter, what, that wasn't a thing back then. Mm-hmm. And so that's probably the glaring thing. The other books, the family books, my dad also taught me to write in terms of principles, not methods. And principles are enduring. They have a much longer shelf life. So somebody, I might make a pop culture reference that's decades old that people just roll their eyes over. But other than that, the principles are the same.
I love that distinction because I think that, that's something that comes through in your writing, and it's hard to pinpoint because there's so many people that have spoken to family and it goes south somehow, like it gets misapplied, or people start to find their hope in it or feel like their salvation or the success of their family is tied to it. And as you're saying that, I'm thinking, wow, I do think a lot of those books taught more of a method versus the overarching principle, because Elisha and I have talked a lot about that, like why you offer such practical advice for family, and yet why is it so free of legalism and just so refreshing? And I don't know, it's very freeing, and yet it's still very practical. And I think it's very hard to ride that line sometimes.
You put your finger on what the difference is. So, and again, this is back to my dad, principles, not methods. So my dad in the 60s wrote a book called Principles of War, and he applies principles of military warfare to spiritual warfare. That's what it's all about. He was a Naval Academy graduate and went to the Naval War College while he was in the Navy. And principles are things like mobility, surprise, concentration. So you could be an ancient general fighting with bows and arrows and spears, and you have to apply all the same principles. If you're fighting with aircraft carriers and airplanes and modern weaponry, the weaponry, that's the method. The principles are constant. So a modern general can study what Sun Tzu wrote centuries ago, millennia ago, or what Clausewitz wrote centuries ago, and it's timeless because it's principles, right? And so consequently, principles are as practical as methods are, but they're much more transferable. So let's say I'm writing, we brought up our kids in a Christian school, but I can write in terms of principles that we are following, and a homeschool family can read it and make just a little tweak in their head, and it plugs right in. There's an adapter built in.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, that is really powerful, because that is something that Katie and I've spent a lot of time discussing, because we both grew up in homeschool Christian families with amazing fathers and amazing parents. But we had been in and out of various conservative Christian homeschool communities and organizations that seemed to offer so much hope on the surface, right? The marketing was like, man, that's some great marketing right there. And the tactics are actually effective for some time. But then over time, it seems like, wow, the root wasn't quite in Christ, wasn't quite in the gospel. And it seems like people, maybe pastors in general, because of a fault of some legalistic organizations, want to stay away altogether from giving anything that might be practical advice, say. And so a lot of modern day parenting books or marriage books are just kind of, well, here's some big picture concepts. Go figure it out for yourself.
Yeah, we're all going to heaven.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm so grateful in the principally driven books that you've written, and yet you not being afraid to get practical at the same time. And I wonder if, even in regards to that, going back to your own family, because I've heard you mention your father a handful of times, and like I said, we listen to your children. They reference you and your wife quite often. So you see just the legacy right there, multi-generational faith playing out. Was that something that your father was very intentional in teaching you, saying, hey, the gospel is the gospel, but then these good works we've been created for are also practical? Or was that the type of thing that you were molding after your childhood, and then now, bringing your children into the world? Or was that the type of thing that you kind of had from the start?
My dad was very intentional about this. And we have, he was, he's with the Lord now, but he was Baptistic and not Reformed, but he believed what the Bible taught about generations and generational faithfulness. And I've incorporated that into a Reformed and covenantal understanding. He didn't use that terminology, but he very much was about believing what the Bible says about thousands of generations. He was in the ministry. There were four of us. I was the oldest of four, and we all knew, and it wasn't like a sword dangling over our heads or a threat, but we all knew that if any of us walked away from the Lord, my dad would step down from ministry that day, because of what he considered the neglected qualification of 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1. Minister needs to keep his own household in order. And my dad believed that was, by the grace of God, a real possibility. And so we were brought up in the faith. We expected our kids to grow up in the faith. And now our grandkids are having kids. So we're great-grandparents now. Not just okay grandparents. We're great-grandparents.
Nice. Nice.
Wow. And you touched on that. That's something I'm actually curious about. And you might have covered this. I'm sure you have somewhere. But so when did you become, start understanding Reformed theology then?
So that started probably in 1988. So I was a pastor for maybe a decade. I began pastoring in 1977, and through a series of circumstances, basically someone in our community started teaching openness theology, where chance governs some things and God doesn't know what's going to happen tomorrow on some issues. And that just appalled me. But given my Arminian theology, I didn't really have a good answer, because that's where my premises led. And so I thought, I began studying I'd been reading the Calvinists on everything but Calvinism, because I was very prejudiced against it. And I thought, well, the Calvinists would be good on this chance business. And so I started reading them. I became, a long story, but I became a Calvinist in 1988. And I began preaching that way. And that attracted, and we were the only Calvinistic church in our whole area. And that attracted, grad students who had a Reformed or Presbyterian background. They started to come, and a young couple that came that way had a baby, and they asked me to baptize it. And I thought, are you crazy? Do I look like an idiot? So that caused me to open that chapter. So between 1988 and 1993, I went from Evangelical Arminian Baptistic to Reformed Presbyterian Covenantal, roughly.
Okay, that's interesting to hear that journey.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's so powerful is that I think something that you say, and again, it's along the lines of you want your theology, you want to see it like you want it to come out your fingertips or something along those lines.
Theology comes out your fingertips, and whatever it is that is coming out your fingertips is your theology.
Amen.
That's your true theology.
Yes, I forget who said it, but they said, we're all theologians, just some of us are bad ones. And I think that that's the case, that you live how you believe God to be and who you believe. I think it's that A.W. Tozer, the beginning of his book, Knowledge of the Holy, what comes to mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you. And you see that certainly in your writings and family, right? You're saying, okay, this isn't just, hey, this is helpful apart from, gospel understanding. You're saying, well, no, this is actually built on an understanding of the gospel and who God is and what he's designed from the beginning of time. I know we're really, we're right here in the trenches of raising children. We've got 5 young children, and we want to be able to equip them to engage in the world that they're living in, that they're growing up in. At the same time, we both have a handful of friends or numerous friends that grew up in Christian homes, went away to liberal institutions, and then started saying that everything was nuanced. And the next thing we knew, they, were not professing Christians at all. And that seems to be a popular case. How did you go about equipping your children to be firm in the faith, but then also going out to liberal institutions evenly, even going to college, going to university, and then engaging in the world?
So an essential, some of this might be, I don't know how radical it is, but this is the way we thought of it. For us, public school, government schools were just a non-starter. You forget about it. So a baseline is that you want to bring up your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and you want them to be in an environment dominated by the Word of God, under the authority of the Word of God. The administrators, the teachers, the board, the parents, the kids, everybody's under the authority of the Word of God. And you want your children to grow up in that environment, and you want them to be there until the concrete is dry. Okay. Now, that's not to say that every kid in a Christian school is going to turn out, because you can undo a lot at home. And there are schools they've got the great talk on the brochure, but it's not really happening in the classroom. But if it's a good Christian school and it's godly Christian parents who are working together with the school to reinforce this, the fundamental issue is the children being brought up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord in such a way as they are loyal to it, not just know it in their heads. So you've probably heard me say this before, but the task of Christian parents is not to get your kids to conform to the standard. Your job is to get your kids to love the standard. That's the task. And the way that you inculcate your children's loyalty to you and to your God is by being loyal to them. That you model for them what familial loyalty looks like. You live it out. And kids who know that their father and their mother are loyal to them are going to be loyal in return. So one of the things that Nancy and one of the things we've been greatly blessed by is that familial loyalty, that sense of covenantal unity and belonging. Um, somebody once exhorted my kids. It didn't cause mortal offense, but almost. But they were exhorting my kids. My kids were grown, and this person was leaving, and they were encouraging my kids never to be embarrassed of their dad, which mortally offended my kids, because our family has loyalty levels that's up there with the Sicilian mafia, you know. It's like, but that comes from Nancy and me being loyal to them. We wanted to be loyal to them in a way that's governed by the Word of God, and so the kids learned that and returned that. And so one of the things that is one of the great blessings I recently had, I was just interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and he asked me, out of all your kids and grandkids, how many of them are Christian? And I was able to say all of them, and that's 18 grandchildren and 2 great grandchildren, and everybody loves, and my kids and their spouses, everybody loves the Lord, and is walking with them. That shouldn't be abnormal.
Yeah, I mean, I tell you what, that's inspirational right there. It really is. We want that to be true in our home. Again, we come from a godly legacy, and we're grateful for that. But you know, when I hear that, you know, knowing that the crown of an old man is his children's children, you know, and knowing that they're in the Lord, there's no greater joy than to know that your children are walking in truth. That is something that I'm certainly striving for, and we want. And you know, even as your children have gotten older, you've now got grandchildren. I'm curious how you were able to teach or maybe model having a backbone, having thick skin, but also walking with humility. Because I think that in this world that we're coming up in, you know, we hear flack all the time, you know, and you say, oh, in order to succeed, you just need to have thick skin. But then the Proverbs talk about, you know, a man that isolates himself seeks his own destruction. And you know, of course, in the counsel of many, there is safety. And we want a humble heart, a contrite heart before the Lord and before those that are around us, and see maybe some shortcomings in our life. And so how did you model that, and how did you teach that in your children?
Okay, so I'll give you one example. I think it's the parents' job to protect their kids and adjust the kids' encounters with the world in appropriate doses. All right, because when your kids leave home, they're going to meet the world in all its tawdry glory. So if you shelter your boy and just hide him, you know, wrap him up in cotton batting, and then when he's 18, he joins the Navy and he's off in the Philippines dealing with prostitutes who want to, accost him. All your house rules are nothing. If he's not internalized the standards, then isolating him and hiding him away isn't going to do that. So you have to equip him and walk him through how a Christian thinks about the world, what the world has to offer, how the world thinks, and so on. So an example of this, but you don't do it by throwing your kids in the deep end. You don't send them off to the government school where they're immersed in godlessness, right? What you want them to be is in a godly, loving, caring environment, nurturing their loyalties, at the same time exposing them to appropriate doses of unbelief. So this is no longer the way it is now. But when my kids were in junior high school, is right when MTV was first launching. Okay, and music videos were a thing. And so what I do, instead of saying this is a Christian home, we don't do that, what I would do is I would sit down with the kids. We turn on MTV. We'd watch one video. Obviously, we didn't watch any of the really skanky ones, but we would watch a video, and then I'd turn it off, and then I'd say, okay, what was that? what were they saying? What was the worldview of that was being represented by this band? Was it hedonism? Was it nihilism, black despair? Was it postmodernism? Everything's random. What was it? So a lot of Christians just stop at that's bad. Okay, the devil's behind that somehow, somewhere, some way. But that's bad doesn't give you any ability to think through it. Because if you learn to think through it, this goes back to our earlier point. If you learn to think through it, you're thinking in terms of principles. Okay. If you say, well, that video was bad because they had 80s hair, or it was but what are you going to do 20 years later when some pop star is promoting the same philosophy but with completely different hair? What do you do? Right? If you just focus on the fact that this was a glam rock band with the hair, or, a hair farmer band, or if it was Halloween hair, if you just focus on things like that, you're not thinking in terms of principles. So if it's a loving relationship, you've got open channels of communication, and you're the one initiating the conversations, right? You sit down with them, let's watch some music videos, and then you turn it off and you make the kids think. Another example would be, Mom, Dad, can I go with the kids to watch, all my friends to go watch Stupid Movie 3, right? Yeah, everybody's raving about it. If depending on the age, I would say if they're 12, no. No, but we told, I need to back up for another principle here. When our kids were little, they lived in a very strict, regulated, totalitarian police state. We just governed them very, very strictly. But as they grew older, the idea is to remove restrictions, because you're wanting them to internalize the standard and love the standard, adopt it for themselves, as opposed to what a lot of parents do when kids are little and sin is relatively cute and relatively harmless. That incident in the restaurant was embarrassing, but nobody bled, right? But you'd let it go. So parents let it go. And then when the kids move into adolescence and they're old enough to get pregnant, or to get somebody pregnant, or buy drugs, or to do something that would seriously wreck their life, parents panic, and then they start putting on restrictions. They start adding restrictions. But that's the time when you should be taking them off, right? So we were very strict when the kids were little. And then when our oldest, Becca, was 16, I told her, Becca, when the girls ask you about going to a movie, you can go to any movie you want. You have the authority to say yes. We trust you. Right? So that's the goal. Now, let's say you're in the gray area, you're not quite there, and your child has not been given a free pass, but they ask if they can go to Stupid Movie 3. I think the answer should be sure. But what we've just done is we've established the agenda for our dinner table discussion tomorrow night. Okay, because you're going to give us a movie review, and it's going to be a worldview analysis of Stupid Movie 3. Okay, now if you back up, if you just said no, you can't go to this movie, and the kid's going to say, why not? Then mom or dad runs off to screenit.com to count the hells and dams, right? Which everybody knows is inadequate. That's not getting at the issue. Well, then if you tell your kid, okay, tomorrow night you're going to give a movie review with a biblical worldview analysis, then they run off to screenit.com to count the hells and dams. Well, that's inadequate. It's still inadequate. That's still not the thing, right? So let's say they give a lame review. it was funny. I laughed in spots. There was one bad scene, and I went to get popcorn during the bad scene. Okay, something like that. And you file away. Okay, thanks, Billy. And then the next time, Dad, can I go see Stupid Movie 4? The answer is no. What's wrong with Stupid Movie 4? I don't know. I have no idea. I do know that your last movie review was lame, right? So the issue is not the movie. The issue is, are you thinking like a Christian when you ingest entertainment, right? Same thing with their Spotify playlist. Are you thinking like a Christian? And what most parents ought to do is, if you're in that in between age where the kids are transitioning out of being told what to do, and they're close to the age where they're going to start making decisions for themselves, what parents need to do is say, hey, can I see your Spotify playlist? Sure. And you say, okay, there are 13 songs here with explicit warnings on them. Instead of saying, how dare you, young man? Instead of doing that, you should say, so what's your thinking about that? And you have to have the kind of home where thinking is required, right? We can't just say, this is our standard, don't ask questions. That's just not good enough. So if you have a different standard, son, I want to hear you thinking. I want to talk with you, right? And if you do that, you're going to bring up kids who see past the superficial smokescreen that the world generates for almost all of pop culture entertainment. Almost all of it's glitz.
I'm curious. So you mentioned, waiting for that concrete to dry, right, before you send them off somewhere. And by the time your kids were 18, by walking them through the critical thinking this way, did you have any fear in sending either of your daughters to college or your son? Or were you so like, they are rock solid, we have great communication, it's going to be great?
So I have 2 daughters and 1 son. All of them could... I was very confident with regard to the stability of all 3. They were just really, all of them were rock solid. Nathan was in a different category than the girls, however, and and this is because men are built for battle in a way that women are not. And so I don't have any doubt that the girls could have acquitted themselves very well defending the faith in a secular university, but they would have had no fun. Right? It would have been just tedious, and I don't like this, and I don't feel like I'm in the right place. And when they're thrown into a situation like that, they handle themselves very well and could have back then. Nate so the girls went through New St. Andrews College, the college that we have here, Christian college. Nate did New St. Andrews and the University of Idaho both, and he wanted to. He was going to the U of I because he wanted to play Division I basketball, and he walked on. He was taking this. He was taking a row of courses that were pretty lame. One of them was an English composition class that was taught by a woman that was just perfectly foul, just awful. And she assigned a movie to the class that was it was existential, do what you feel, nothing matters, don't let anybody tell you what to do. And then they assigned the class a 3-page paper interacting with the movie. And Nate's paper was, I used to be pretty conservative and uptight, but I learned from this movie that you shouldn't let anybody tell you what to do if you don't feel like it. And I don't feel like writing a 3-page paper. So
Nice.
So there's a little paragraph. He stapled it to 2 blank sheets of paper and handed it in. And a week or 2 later, he was called out of class, which is pretty bad in college, when you get called out into the hallway in college. And the teacher said, I'm going to flunk you on this paper. And if you don't do it over, I'm going to flunk you for the course. And he said something like, you do know I wasn't just horsing around. I was making a serious point with this. And she said, well, you can't take these things to their logical conclusion. Right. Wow. So, and yeah. And so what her message was, is I want you to question everybody's authority but mine. Okay. That was so he was running into things like that at the U of I. And he finally came to me and said, Dad, my Logos education really prepared me to fight the bad guys, but I don't feel like I'm fighting bad guys. I feel like I'm tearing apart a stress doll. I don't feel, I don't feel like I'm getting anywhere. This is just exasperating, beyond exasperating. And I'm thinking of just switching over and doing New St. Andrews. And I said, and this was one of the first moments where I think both he and I learned how to do what we call reading the story you're in. Right. So he said, I think I'm going to switch over to NSA. And I said, okay, but you do know that if you switch over to NSA, you do know that you're going to get a call from the basketball coach inviting you to come on the team. He'd already done his walk-on tryouts. And he said, yeah, I know. It doesn't matter. So he came to New St. Andrews, and a week later, he got a call from the basketball coach saying, inviting him on. And that's another, basically, it's an example of loyalty in action. Loyalties, your functioning loyalties. And ultimately, it's the loyalty to the truth. Because if you've taught them to think, they see the truth, they can identify the lie. And if they can identify the lie and see the truth, and they're loyal to the truth, then they're going to want to be with people who are loyal to the truth.
Wow. Thank you for all of that. That's so encouraging. When I think about teaching my children to love the standard, I certainly want that. I want them to love the standard, not just refrain or have distaste or disdain for the lies in the world and whatnot. But going back real quick to kind of talking through how you would handle movies or content with your children as they grew, I'm curious as whether or not you've seen, in your own family or just in your pastoral ministry, people maybe not because I'm with you. Narrative seems to be far more influential even than content at times, right? Where you're thinking, okay, it's what is this movie teaching? What is it saying is true? What it's shaping their worldview. However, I do think, especially with young children, content, well, actually just for anybody, for adults, content still matters, right? Like there comes a point where you're saying, well, no, that is, the Philippians 4, whatsoever things are true and lovely and of a good report, whatever, that's not helpful in any way. It's harmful. It's sinful. It's pornographic or anything like that. Did you find yourself having to ever kind of like backpedal a bit and be like, whoa. Like, I mean, yeah, you get the leash, or do you ever feel like you've had to pastor other parents in doing that, where you're saying, yeah, we want to give liberties so that they can talk through it, but at the same time, maybe you hadn't done a good enough job in those younger years teaching them to love the standard. And so then how do you then kind of react to that place?
Yeah. So going back to my example with Becca, let's say some parents said, okay, honey, you can watch whatever movie you want. And then the kid goes nuts. Should the parent reel it in? Well, yeah, absolutely reel it in. Okay, we misjudged that. But when you do that, you talk it through with your kids. You say, we gave you this liberty because we thought you were ready for it. You're clearly not. But at least now you know that this is what we want for you. Is we don't want you to be under our thumb for the next 30 years. We are preparing you to leave the nest. That's what we want. And so we're going to withdraw the permission we gave, but we're going to try again next summer. Right. So they know what direction it's going. In our case, we were very fortunate. We didn't have to walk anything back. It was the kids did a great job. But part of that had to do with how strict we were early on. So I mean, our kids went to a Christian school. All their friends were friends from church or from the Christian school. They'd go to a birthday party for third graders, and everybody in that party was going to heaven when they die. And at the birthday party, they're going to watch a movie. We were the kind of parents who would say, "What movie?" Right?
Yeah.
And maybe you might have to come home. Maybe so. And these were all good people, and our standards were really tight, but they were tight with the intention of loosening them, not tight because we couldn't help it.
Yeah, that's
Good distinction.
that is good distinction. And I know, anytime you give hard numbers, people are going to take that as law. But if you talk about that time when you feel like the cement's dried, right, or it's set, or whatever, or you feel like you can loosen the leash, or you're really strict. Roughly, what just in your case, was that like, age 10, age 12, age 14? Because again, not to give the rule for everybody, because I know each individual is different, but can you kind of speak at least to your experience and what that was like for your family?
Yeah, when I was a kid growing up, my parents practiced and we practiced the same thing. These are just going back to remember principles, not methods. Don't write this down and say this is the law. But we thought that corporal punishment, for example, spankings, should be 90% of them should happen in the preschool years, where you're just establishing authority. And so before 5 and under is when most of the spankings would occur. During the elementary years, there'd be the occasional course correction, right? And by the time your kid is 12, you should be all done. Right. And be phasing into real time consequences, because you're preparing them for real time. You're preparing them for, so if you do something like that on the job 20 years from now, there will be real time consequences. So that's where you break the window, you pay for it. You phase them into real time consequences. So with that strictness growing up, and so roughly 12, you're not speaking to them with any kind of physical restraint at all. Now, after that point, it should be all discussion, showing from the word, teaching, Bible, discipleship, basically. It'd be the discipleship era. We would say that the junior high years were the years where we would wrestle things to the ground. So doctrinal things, standards, and so here's the standard. We would set the standard, but then we would open the floor for discussion of the standard, or open the floor for discussion of whatever the doctrinal issue was. That was roughly the junior high years. So by the time the kids were 16, we were ready for them to launch, basically.
Yeah, and I'm curious, you mentioned when it came to the kids, higher education, it was a little bit different for, Nate versus the girls. Did you parent your boys and girls that much differently up until that point? Did you feel like, there were things your girls were more ready for, or Nate was more ready for, or was it just, all over the map?
It was the same education with different targets. Okay. So I remember when I gave the talk at Logos School the year Becca graduated from Logos. She was the first, she entered Logos's first year as a kindergartner. And when she was graduating as a senior, I was the one who was giving the talk. And I remember saying to Becca, part of the charge, the reason we had you read Herodotus and learn, the reason we had you get this first-rate education is because we wanted to equip you to be a godly wife and mother. That's what we were doing. Now, and this is another thing. If you're in a homeschool setting, I love reminding people the level of education that your daughters receive is going to roughly be the level of education that your grandsons receive. There are some, unfortunately, in Christian circles who think that women just need to be taught enough literacy to be able to read the instructions on the biscuit box, and if they can follow those, then we're good. But you're not. but you're doing a real disservice to your grandsons and your granddaughters. I think it's Mr. Knightley and Emma says, whatever you think, men do not want silly wives. Um, and it's really true. They don't want silly wives and they don't want silly children. And so we gave the same education. The kids took the same courses, but they knew that Nate was being equipped to go in this direction, and the girls were being equipped to discharge their responsibilities in another. So basically, it was an all-purpose tool.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. You know, I mentioned earlier I enjoyed your book on productivity. I think you call it productivity, and it was pretty, even just the intro there. One of your daughters wrote it, and she talked about how she said you were the most productive man that she's ever seen in her entire life, and you continue to be that way. You filled every minute of your day, it appeared to her, with something productive and intentional, and yet she felt like she was never competing, nor were any of her siblings competing with projects. You know, they weren't competing with what you were working on theologically or whatever. Even when you were learning Latin, they weren't competing for your time. You were fully vested in them. And that's something that I think is really encouraging to hear. And even in your your theology of work, I feel like it really, to me, highlighted two paths I feel like I'm prone to going down. And that is, oh man, pour into work, pour into, providing financially or excelling in my career, or really just give my heart to my children and be here in this, be present in the home, bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. What was it that really enabled you or gave you the capability to, again, plod along and create so many resources? You know, I think it's over 100 books now, if I'm not mistaken, that you've written, starting a school, pastoring a church, and on and on and on, starting a press, publishing company, and then truly be with your children in your heart, in your affection, and then have them feel that. So what are some things that you feel like men oftentimes miss on one of those things, and something that you feel like the Lord enabled you to see and then exercise in those years?
I'm indebted to my dad for teaching us. He was this way, but when in doubt, read the instructions. So I knew as a minister, I knew that my kids, my family, were my essential qualification for doing what I was doing. It didn't make any sense for me to be flying around the country telling people about the importance of family. Well, my kids just saw the back of my head. And then if I'd done that and the family blew up or melted down or did something like that, well, that destroyed the whole thing. What good is it? Who wants to read the family books of some guy who lost his own kids? So I knew from Scripture, I knew from my dad, the example of my dad, that my family was my basic qualification for doing what I was doing. So, and I write a lot. I tell people I write to make the little voices in my head go away, but it's not working. But even though I've written a lot of books, I didn't publish my first book until I was almost 40. Right. And the reason for that is I was starting the school, teaching classes in the school where my kids were. I was coaching Nate's lacrosse team. I was involved with the kids because they were the essential prep work for, if I wanted to be productive later on, they were my diploma. And I had to think of them in terms of the diploma. Now, there are times when the ox is in the ditch. There are times when you've got some crazy, silly season going on. One time was the remodel of Logos School. We bought an old roller rink, and we were volunteer labor, and so you've got this crazy season. But that has to be the exception. And I would say to men, if there does come a time you're taking a course in whatever, personal enrichment or whatever, and you need to do it, but you've got a teeming horde of kids, instead of working late at the office and coming home after they're in bed, if there's a crunch, dad should be the one to take the hit. And what I mean by that is you come home at 5, have dinner with your family, wrestle with the kids, put them to bed, and then do your work. Or even better yet, so you don't shortchange your wife, better yet, get up at 4:30. Well, I've got to get this done. I've got this assignment tomorrow. So why don't you arrange it so that you're the only one in the family that takes the hit, right? Everybody else has dad time. Everybody else has dinner with dad. Everybody else has wrestle time with dad. Everybody else life is normal, right? And you've got to get this done. So you lose an hour of sleep, right? Instead of making your kids or your family pay in a different way. Just restructure it wherever possible.
Yeah.
That's good. And I have a question, because all your family, you mentioned loyalty, and all your family's working together right now. It's so cool to see, publicly and privately. And so I'm just curious, did you always have the vision? Like, do you feel like you're living right now the fulfillment of a vision you envisioned at the time when you were raising your kids? Or do you feel like it looks totally different, but God's just orchestrated it?
Yeah.
The
The details look different because we didn't know what documentary or what project or what book we'd be working on. But we always envisioned working together. That was always part of the assumption. Yes.
And how did you pass that on to your kids? Did you just talk about working together with excitement, and they just were like, yeah, we want to be a part of whatever you're going to be a part of? Like, how did you pass on that desire?
We did it by means of child labor.
You just brought them along.
My dad, when I was a kid, my dad used to run Christian bookstores. And I remember us going down annually to help him inventory the store. So we would work to inventory the store. It was before computers, and we'd inventory the store, and my dad would pay us in books, right? For 20 years, we had a magazine called Credenda Agenda, and this magazine ran for 20 years during my kids' childhood. And we would have Credenda parties where we would stuff and attach labels, and the kids would be assembling the magazines. And I'd pay them in pizza or pay them in donuts, or, this is just what we do.
That's pretty,
so cool.
yeah, that is very cool. And, I'm curious as to whether or not you've seen that vision applied in different ways, whether it's through people in your church, because, you're a pastor, you're an author, and then many of your kids have taken on, or all your kids right now have that capability. They're great writers, they're great communicators, but that might not be every family, right? Like if the dad's an engineer for, Downtown Incorporated here in town, how can he give a similar vision where it's saying, hey, we might not all be working in the same specific career, but there is this they can have their equivalent. That dad can still be the godfather, so to speak, right, of his family. To going back to that kind of like that mafia model of, hey, no, we are all in this together. How can they see that applied in different ways?
You'd be surprised at how often engineering runs in the family. So that's one thing. But there are exceptions, and so we've been privileged to see in Moscow here we have a Sabbath dinner tradition, and this is whether you're an engineer or a plumber or a doctor or a writer, you have to eat dinner, right? And so one of the things that we've seen a number of families do is we have a Sabbath dinner Saturday night to prep for the Lord's Day. The whole family gathers for a Sabbath dinner, and we all eat and celebrate and drink together, and then we all go worship together. That's the central thing that ties us together, not vocation, right? And a number of families, extended families in Moscow, do that. They all get together Saturday night preparing for worship, and that means that keeps the ties close.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's pretty great to see. Well, Pastor Douglas Wilson, we want to respect your time. Are there any closing thoughts? To what's something, if you had a billboard right now that you could say anything you want to say on it to a family that's maybe in our state, maybe they are roughly 30 years of age, they've got a couple young children, what's right here in 2024 kind of a general message you want to get out to young families?
The message would be, believe God's promises, take the long view. Okay, I remember times when we were in the thick of it, when our kids were littles, and Nancy had a pile of dishes, a pile of diapers, pile of laundry, all of this going on, and the kids are running around in the living room sinning, doing their thing, and you have to correct them and teach them and stuff. There were times when I would encourage Nancy and say, we need to take the long view. Remember God's promises, take the long view. This is a momentary, what we're experiencing right now is momentary. And it really is amazing how fast it flies by. It really is amazing, because I still feel, I still think like a young man. And I've got great grandchildren, and I'm thinking, who did this to me? And when did I? But there it is, and it really did fly by, and so particularly husbands need to appreciate their wives who are in the trenches more than the husband is, right? Usually, so she's the one dealing with the minute-to-minute chaos. So husbands appreciating their wives. Husbands encouraging their wives, but encouraging them with the word of God. This is not the permanent state of affairs.
Yeah, that's really good.
That is encouraging.
Okay, I feel like that's a really good thing to end on, but I did have one more question on work ethic. And I was just curious, how did you teach your kids work ethic? Because you have incredible work ethic. Your children do. It seems like your grandchildren do. I know this is like a really practical question, but we get this question a lot, and I'm curious what your take is on it.
Basically, working together. So if you've got a good relationship with God and with your kids, working together is time with dad. Instead of saying, "Go clean the basement, minions," I'll come back in a couple of days and see if you did a good job. It's far better to say, "Let's go clean the basement," and enlist them, and they're working alongside you, and it's dad time.
That's really good. Yeah, just that subtle shift of going with them, doing it together, having it be relational building instead of sending them away. I think it'd be huge. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. All right, Pastor Douglas Wilson. Well, thank you so much. And we'll be sure to link everything where people can find you below so they can order your books. They can subscribe to Canon Plus, because I tell you what, through your productivity methods, you've been able to put out quite the volume of content. And so we've got our work cut out for us going through all of it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. When it goes live, send it to us and I can kick it down the road.
Will do.
Thanks.
Thank you. Blessings.